Thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to walk you through a couple things. We want to talk about balancing reactions. We want to talk about significant figures and then how to do math with significant figures. So your test is coming up. Just as a quick review for those of you that need some more practice, I'm going to go a little bit quick while I'm talking. Feel free to pause it at any time and just reflect and try and get the information. So first thing we need to know is that we have a reaction here. This is nitrogen plus hydrogen is going to yield nitrogen trihydride. So whenever you combine these things, you need to know that we have reactants, which are like ingredients, and then you have products. So on your test, that's going to be a question. It's going to ask you what's the reactants and what's the product. Super easy. Everything to the left of the arrow is a reactant. Everything to the right is a product. So when I ask you to balance it, first thing you need to know is that these are called subscripts. The little numbers sort of down to the right of your elements, those are called subscripts, and they only apply to the element directly to the left. So this 2 is only going to apply to this nitrogen, so we've got 2 nitrogens and we have 2 hydrogens. Now moving over here, this nitrogen we only have 1, okay? So there's no number next to the letter, next to the element, so that's understood to be a 1. There's an invisible 1 there. So we've got 1 nitrogen, but we have 3 hydrogens. Note that this 3 does not apply to the nitrogen. It only applies to the element directly to the left. As we can see, our nitrogens and our hydrogens are both unbalanced. Just as a pro tip, elements like carbon, nitrogen, chlorine, those are usually typically easier to balance than hydrogen and oxygen. I usually leave hydrogen and oxygen alone until the very end. So I'm going to balance my nitrogens first. So I've got 2 here, and I've got 1 here. So I'm going to put a coefficient. Okay, so these are coefficients, and they're going to apply to every element in the compound. So this 2 now is going to be multiplied times this invisible 1 here. So now instead of having 1 nitrogen, I now have 2 nitrogens. I'm going to cross that out and write 2. So I've got 2 nitrogens. Now the thing that you have to remember is that that coefficient 2 is going to apply to every element in the compound. Okay, so this 2 is also going to apply to my hydrogen. So now I'm going to multiply 3 times 2, which is going to change my hydrogens to 6. Okay, now don't freak out. When you change this to 6, we can easily come back over here and change this one. So that's what we're going to do. Our nitrogens are good, 2 and 2. Our hydrogens are not, 6 and 2. So what coefficient do I want to put right here in front of my hydrogen to make this equal 6? Well, you're just going to put a 3 there, because 3 times 2 is 6. Okay, like I said, pause, go back if you need to look at that again. We're going to do one more review, balancing reaction over here. This one's a little more complex. The thing that you want to keep in mind with this is that when you have parentheses, the number outside the parentheses is going to apply to both of the elements, but not any elements outside. So let's put our numbers here. Lead has an invisible 1. This oxygen has got 2. This 2 is going to apply to that oxygen because it's outside that parentheses. And I also have 3 hydrogens. And you say 3, I thought that was 2. No, it's 3 because I've got 2 times 1 is 2, but I also have a hydrogen right here. So I'm going to have a total of 3 hydrogens and then 1 chlorine. On the product side, I'm going to have 1 lead that comes from here. I've got 1 oxygen that comes from here. I've got 2 hydrogens that come from here, and then 2 chlorines. Okay? So now I'm going to look at my elements that I've reported. 1, 1, they're good. Oxygen, 2, 1, that needs to be balanced. Hydrogen needs to be balanced. And chlorine needs to be balanced. Now remember my pro tip. Elements like carbon, chlorine, nitrogen, they're easier to balance. So let's do those first. I've got 2 here, but only 1 here. So I know immediately I'm going to have to put a coefficient of 2 here. So 2 times 1 is now 2. But remember, this coefficient is going to also apply to the hydrogen. It applies to every element in that compound. So 2 times 1 is 2 plus these 2. So now I have, instead of 3 hydrogens, I now have 4. All right. Now I'm going to go, now this messed up my hydrogen. So I'm going to come over here to my hydrogens and balance them. I've got a 2 here. I need a total of 4. So in order to balance that, I have to put a coefficient of 2 here. So now 2 times 2 equals 4. remember, this coefficient is also going to apply to my oxygen, so 2 times the invisible 1 is going to be 2. And unless I'm mistaken, that should be balanced. So let's look at all of our elements. 1, 1, we're good. 2, 2, we're good. 4, 4, we're good. 2, 2, everything's balanced. So that is balancing a reaction. We're going to skip over here, back over here to significant figures. With significant figures, there's only 3 rules you need to know. Okay? Any zero that goes behind a number, any trailing 0 with no decimal is never going to count, ever. So let's look up here. We need to, all I'm asking you here is tell me how many significant figures there are. There is 1 sig fig here. 1 sig fig. These 3 zeros do not count as significant figures because they're trailing with no decimal. In this one, I've got 2 significant figures. Leading zeros never count. I always make my students repeat. Leading zeros never count. Even, it doesn't matter how many decimals there are. These 2 never count, okay, because they are leading. They lead those numbers. So there's only 2 sig figs right here. These are sandwich zeros. Those are fun and easy. They always count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have 5 sig figs. These are sandwich zeros, okay, and they are always going to count as sig figs. This one right here, this is going to have 4 sig figs. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the tricky one. Trailing zeros always count if there's a decimal, but only if there's a decimal. Notice I did something like, these are very similar, right? I've got 4,000 and then 0.4000. This one counts as 4 because there's a decimal. These three trailing zeros count because there's a decimal, all right? So I have 4 total sig figs, but only 1 up here. So trailing zeros count with a decimal, sandwich zeros always count, and leading zeros never, ever, ever count. All right, addition and subtraction. When we do math with sig figs, there's two types of math, okay? You've got addition and subtraction, you got multiplication and division. Okay, we all know this. With addition and subtraction, you report your final answer as the same number of decimal places as you did in your math problem. So I've got 2 decimal places here and 1 decimal place here, right? 5, 2, that's 2 decimal places. 0.3, that's 1 decimal place. So I'm going to do this math. 13.82. However, that's 2 decimal places, but in our problem we have one of the terms only had 1 decimal place. So I have to report this in 1 decimal place, which is going to be 13.8. That 8 is that first decimal place. I need to look at the next number and see if I need to round up. If you round up if you have 5 or above. So anything below 5, you leave it. You leave this number. So 13.8 is my final answer. Last thing, you guys are doing great. Remember, pause and go back if you need to. Multiplication and division, okay? Now with multiplication and division, this is the hard one. You have to report your final answer in the least number of sig figs that we just talked about. Least number of sig figs. So the first thing I like to do is figure out which of my terms, how many sig figs they each have. This one has 3. 1, 2, 3 sig figs, okay? That's a trailing 0 with a decimal, so it counts. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sig figs. So my final answer, you guessed it, has to have 3 sig figs. So I'm going to do this multiplication on my calculator. 2.10 times 4.0010. And the answer my calculator spits out has a lot of digits, okay? 8.4021. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sig figs. But our final answer is not that specific. That's to like the 10,000th. Okay, we weren't that specific with this one, or that accurate. So we have to report it in 3. So 8.40. This is 3 sig figs. 1, 2, 3. We look to the next number. If it's below 5, then we keep this number. We keep the number before. If it's after 5, if it's 5 or more, then we would round up. But since it's not, our final answer is 8.4. So on your sheet, you're going to have 2 or 3 problems. I want you guys to practice those by yourself. I hope this helped. Thank you so much.